On Tuesday, Israel decided it would no longer work with the UN Human Rights Council. It became the first country to boycott a review of its human rights record.
It's like 5 hours from Suleimania, where I live. So I was visiting there for the day around Thanksgiving. I had the opportunity to visit and to see the refugee camp where like 35,000 people are living now.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Israel is the first country to boycott a UN review of its human rights record. The result is that the UN Human Rights Committee issued a stern report on the settlements. An Israeli journalist said that compared to this report, the Goldstone report on Gaza was just child's play. We begin with an Al Jazeera video about this development. Then to some protest activities outside Obama's inauguration. A can-can dance by Code Pink against gun and drone violence. Chants against sending more billions to Israeli apartheid, and a protest against the drones. Featured on the show, an interview with Johanna Rivera, who is living in the Kurdish part of Iraq and who visited a refugee camp of Syrians in Iraq. Then attorney Stephen Downs from the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, talking about the families who suffer when their loved ones are entrapped by the Justice Department. Then a video from 350.org, a thought bubble by climate activist Bill McKibben on the eve of the crucial February 17th rally against the Keystone XL pipeline.
Israel calls it a biased report. Palestinians say it's courageous. The UN Human Rights Council says the transfer of Israeli civilians into the West Bank is against the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention and could be tried as a war crime in the International Criminal Court.
By refusing to comply with international law and the will of the international community, Israel itself is acting outside the law.
The UN report also called on Israel to cease all settlement activities without preconditions and immediately initiate a process of withdrawal of all settlers. It also says the settlements are leading to a creeping annexation that prevents the establishment of a contiguous and viable Palestinian state. The UN team interviewed Palestinians who had had their land confiscated by Israel and farmers whose olive trees had been attacked by settlers. But Israel, which didn't cooperate with the investigation, says the report is one-sided. On Tuesday, Israel decided it would no longer work with the UN Human Rights Council. It became the first country to boycott a review of its human rights record. Its representative didn't show up for the meeting. While the UN Human Rights Council has criticised Israel in the past, this is the first time it's done so since the UN General Assembly upgraded the status of Palestine to a non-member observer state. The question is, will this encourage the Palestinians to take Israel to the International Criminal Court? Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera, Jerusalem.
Of course, no matter how good the UN report is, it won't mean a thing unless some power confronts Israel. After all, a decade ago, an international court ruled that the apartheid wall was illegal, and it didn't mean a thing. At the end of January, Syria was bombed by Israel. It was unprovoked. Syria hadn't attacked Israel. No doubt it's a test to see how far Israel can go in ravaging its neighbor. Protests, Secretary General of the UN said nothing. U.S. State Department blamed Syria. The Assad regime said that it would retaliate at some point. Of course, that point never approaches. Syria and the regime uses its weapons against its own people. Now for some scenes of protests on the day of the Obama inauguration.
I like to think of this more as Martin Luther King Jr. Day than as inauguration.
Brothers and sisters, shout it loud. Brothers and sisters, shout it loud. We are few and we'll be more. We are few and we'll be more. And we'll end these bloody wars. And we'll end these bloody wars. Can close Guantanamo. Torture we say no, no. Human rights for all. Obama, do it, will you? Can build a world that's free, green with energy that's clean, clean. Peace and love for all. Obama, do it, will you now?
Long live Palestine! Long live Palestine! Not another time! No more money for Israel's crimes! No more money for Israel's crimes!
In the African American community, you are losing friends because you are ashamed to say, I oppose Obama for his policies because he is an elitist conservative. And people do not believe that because of his blackface. And here I am. I stand here today. My name is Twanda Jackson, and I don't have a job.
Shame on us! Oh my God! Look up to the sky!
We've got to end these drone strikes. And I don't understand how the American public can allow this brutal murder to be going on in their names. The drones being used in North Africa now, and it's just going to spread, and this spreads hatred and anger towards the United States, and more terrorism, more fomenting of wars and revolutions that are not peaceful revolutions.
So we brought the drone, walked the drone from Baltimore to D.C. Thought rather than on the day of the inauguration, we would bring the issue of drones and the lack of talk about it in a $2 billion election process.
Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Michael Vane of the United States Capitol Police.
January 21st, 2012.
This is your last warning.
While the nation's joint commemorates
You do not want to be
Barack
arrested.
Obama's inauguration, free of their former home. A few hours after it was obliterated by a Hellfire missile fired from a CIA drone.
To put pressure on the president to say, but we also need things like drone control. We're against violence in our streets, in our communities, and we're against the violence that we're perpetrating overseas.
Why? Please, you have to stop! You have to stop killing children!
Speaking of drones, I want to remind you of the case of the 16-year-old American who was killed by a U.S. drone. His name was Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. His father was killed by a drone. 2 weeks later, he was killed by a drone. He hadn't been convicted of anything. He hadn't been charged with anything. When asked about the killing of the 16-year-old, Obama's press secretary, Robert Gibbs, didn't bother to claim that the 16-year-old in Yemen was any kind of threat to the United States. Instead, he said, I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father if they are truly concerned about the well-being of their children. I don't think becoming an al-Qaeda jihadist terrorist is the best way to go about doing your business. So he was killed because of his father. Perhaps the younger al-Awlaki was killed so he wouldn't revenge his father. The same logic they used against the young Vito Corleone in the movie The Godfather. Who says we don't live in the greatest country on the earth? I'm speaking with Johanna Rivera, who is back from the northern part of Iraq, where she's been working for 2 years. She's a former grad student at UConn and a resident of Puerto Rico. Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you, Stan?
Now, I understand you saw a refugee camp in Syria, but let's first start. Where are you located in Iraq?
I'm living in Suleimania. It's one of the three provinces of the northern part of Iraq, which is under the KRD, the Kurdish regional government.
And it's kind of autonomous or half independent, as I understand.
Yes, it's still part of Iraq, but it's independent from the Baghdad government.
Okay. And where is this Syrian refugee camp, and what is it called?
It's in Duhok. It's in the province of Iraq called Duhok, which is in the border between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It's like 5 hours from Suleimania, where I live. So I was visiting there for the day around Thanksgiving. I had the opportunity to visit and to see the refugee camp where like 35,000 people are living now, escaping, mainly from the Kurdish area of Syria that have escaped the violence.
What does it look like? What is your first impression when you look at this area?
Well, it's a lot of people living in a small area and living in tents, very small tents, and they're not very well equipped, especially because now it's the winter and it's very cold. So they didn't have heating. They were told they were going to get some heaters, portable heaters that are run by kerosene from the UN. But still, even if they get that, how are they going to get the heating? They have to buy kerosene, and they have to be able to run the heaters with kerosene.
How cold does it get in northern Iraq? I'm sure most people here have no idea.
Below 32, below zero. We measure it in Celsius, but it's can be -5, which in the 20s probably at night.
So that's pretty bad. How about food? Who is it the UN who's supplying all this?
Yes, the UN was supplying. They say they got tea, they got flour, they had lentils, very, very basic, and oil, very, very basic, but not enough to feed the whole family for a month.
Mm-hmm. And how did you communicate with these people?
We had a local Kurdish colleague that's been working on the camp providing psychosocial services, and then we had a local Kurd from Suleimania, which is actually a different dialect. So we were speaking in Kurmanji, which is their dialect, and then sometimes translate it into Sorani to then translate it into English.
That sounds complicated.
Yeah, but they were very nice with us. We went into the tent with them, and we spent like more than an hour.
Now, why did they have to run away? I thought that that section was sort of staying out of it, that the Syrian government had said, well, you're on your own now, or something like that. What is going on in the Syrian Kurdish area?
Well, many of these Syrian Kurds, they live or have established in Damascus, in Aleppo. So they were actually living where the conflict is taking place now. So they're originally from the Kurdish area, which is technically more peaceful, I would say. But they work and they have moved with their families to the big cities where the conflict is taking place. So now they have come back, and then were able to cross the border in the Kurdistan region.
So what did they tell you? Who did they blame for the reason they left?
Well, obviously the violence from the regime. In the beginning they thought it was going to be a temporary situation, that they were going to be able to relocate to other parts of Syria, but then even after a year and a half and the conflict hasn't been solved, they fear for their life, they fear for their family, and now they're in a refugee camp. And they were grateful that they're being taken by their Kurdish brothers and sisters, but they were complaining of lack of services, that their children were getting sick, they were not getting the vaccines and the protections, that the schools were very far, and they are afraid to send their children to school, and that something happens, so children are not going to school, people are not working. Some of them can work because they have been given the residency permit. If they're Kurds, they're given the residency permit, so they're legal residents or temporary residents of Kurdistan. But the camp is very far. It's not in the middle of the city. They cannot walk or like to pay a taxi to go and to come every day. Like it's tough, and they have their family living in a camp, and they might not want to leave their family there to.
Did they have hopes that the war in Syria would end? Any reasonable expectations?
Well, they say they hope the conflict will be solved soon, and they will be able to go back to Syria. That's what they.
Did you see any political organizing? Do they support one side or another, or are they just trying to live?
Well, what I heard is that there's PUK and PDK, which are also the parties that are prevalent in the Iraqi region of Kurdistan. So yeah, some people might support the ruling party of the Kurdish regional government, which is the KDP, and some other people will support other political parties.
And I think you mentioned when we talked privately that some of the Kurds in the opposition in northern Iraq want to make another refugee camp?
Yeah, some people in Suleimania are saying that it's not enough, and that there's some families that had been establishing in Suleimania, so they wanted to build a refugee camp in the Suleimania province.
So it's quite a difficult situation over there. What do other people, do you get into any other conversations with Iraqis about Syria and what they think maybe should happen? Or what do they think about all these foreign governments getting involved, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and then the U.S. too?
It's a very sensitive topic, and people are not talking openly about it, so it's very difficult to assess the situation. Some people are not talking at all about it, and some people are very, scared to talk about it. They talk about, the influence of Turkey in the Syrian conflict and even in the Kurdistan region, Iranian influence. It's difficult.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. I've been talking to Johanna Rivera, who has been living in the Kurdish area of northern Iraq. Steve Downs of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms spoke about a month ago at the Conference on Civil Liberties of the Connecticut Coalition Against Indefinite Detention.
Final speaker here today, and I've already thrown out my remarks because everybody here on this panel has already delivered it far much better than I can. I'm with the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, and we're a coalition of 20 civil rights, Muslim, and peace activists that have come together over 3 campaigns: profiling, preemptive prosecution, and prisoner abuse, solitary confinement. We've already talked here today quite a bit about profiling and preemptive prosecution, and I'm not going to talk about that. Preemptive prosecution, solitary confinement, is a serious issue which we haven't spent a lot of time on, but fortunately we have a workshop that's coming up right after this in which we're going to talk about a lot about it. We're going to have people from the community who impacted families who have suffered through solitary confinement. And I think the only point I really want to make about it is that it is time to end solitary confinement now. It has to be a priority. As it is presently being used in this country, it is akin to torture, and it is something we simply have to get rid of. So I'm going to put that off for a moment, but it is going to be related to what I really wanted to talk about, which is one thing that I think perhaps we have not talked about it as much as we might have, and that is the importance in the movement of the impacted families. We talk about the prisoners, we talk about the various things that have happened, but there are many impacted families. And these are people that are very special, and we need to embrace them and bring them in. So many of them have been isolated and marginalized, even within their own communities. And they need to see within us a community that recognizes what happened to them and to make them part of the movement. I was initially hooked on this when I was representing Yassin Araf, the Muslim imam up in Albany. And after he was finally convicted of material support for terrorism in a completely fake framed charge, I went in to see him the day afterwards, and he looked at me and he said, I want to fire you as my lawyer. I was like, oh. And they said, I want to hire you as my brother. He said, I think that lawyers are not going to do me much good anymore, and that family would do me a lot better, and I don't have any family in the country. So I took on the job of being his brother. And with, fortunately, a wonderful group up in Albany that formed, and they're just some really terrific people, we have been trying to keep his family going ever since, along with the co-defendants. And that includes 10 children and 2 wives with no adequate means of support. And this is a very emotional attachment. I'm up here today, not because of the intellectual challenges of all of this. I'm up here because of the emotional connection. I was hooked on that in trying to deal with the issues of what do you do with families who have been impacted as arrests were, and as all of the hundreds of people on the board over there and beyond. Whenever I go to see the wife of Yassin, she always looks at me sometime in the conversation, she works it in, and she says, what did Yassin do? He didn't do anything. Why is he in jail? And I have no answer for it. But I have to struggle with that as an American. As it happened about the same time, I got involved with a group that was representing people who were caught up in deportation proceedings. And I remember sitting with a woman whose husband had just been sent off to deportation camp. He'd been here, he came here as a young child, he was undocumented, he was driving his car to work. A police officer thought he might be a robbery suspect and stopped the car. Turned out he wasn't the robbery suspect, but they discovered he was undocumented, and before anybody knew it, he was off to deportation center. And this young woman and child, of course, had no means of support. They eventually had to move into a house with the Catholic workers, and we were there trying to figure out what to do with him. And at one point she turned to me and she said, what did he do wrong? Why is he being thrown out of the country? And I recognized that question. I said, that's the same question that I'm getting from Zahur. These are 2 entirely different kinds of proceedings. One is an FBI proceeding and anti-terrorism thing. One is an ICE proceeding on a deportation. But the impact to the families is the same. They are destroyed in the same way.
Now, a very well-made animation by 350.org, Bill McKibben, talks about how global climate catastrophe is coming because the oil companies and other energy companies are free to get their carbon waste thrown into the atmosphere without a care in the world. We show it just around the time of the February 17th demonstration in Washington, D.C. against the Keystone XL pipeline.
I wrote the first book about climate change way back in 1989 when I was a young man in my 20s. Now I'm in my 50s, so I've spent my life watching our political system try to cope with the biggest challenge humans have ever faced. So far, they've failed. I used to think that was about some failure of human psychology or our love of the status quo or something like that, but I've changed my mind. I think most people, faced with the spreading plague of drought and flood and failed harvest, are ready to take action. The problem is the fossil fuel industry. It's the most profitable enterprise in the history of the earth. Exxon makes more money each year than any company in the history of money. And much of that profit is based on a simple fact. Alone among industries, it doesn't have to clean up after itself. We let coal and gas and oil barons use the atmosphere as an open sewer into which to dump carbon, their main waste product, for free. That's a sweetheart deal. Imagine you owned a restaurant, and the city let you shovel your waste into the center of the street each night instead of paying for it to be carted away. You'd make more profit too. But soon the streets would be overrun with toxins and trash. Well, that's what's going on in our atmosphere right now. Every sensible economist has said that we should force the fossil fuel industry to pay for the damage carbon creates. But it hasn't happened because this industry of polluters is able to pervert our democracy with endless campaign contributions and lobbying money. I mean, our politicians should be forced to wear decals on their suits like NASCAR drivers. And here's the thing, we're not the radicals. We want a world a little bit like the one we were born into. Oil companies are the radical ones. They're willing to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere in order to make more money. They've already run the carbon level in the atmosphere well past the safe line, 350 parts per million. Now they're trying for a world that, well, it'll jeopardize the future of most living things. Does that seem right to you? So, this is our challenge for the years ahead. If we can break their power, then the planet has a future. I don't know that we can. They are the ones with all the money. So we need to find other currencies, like passion, spirit, creativity. Sometimes we're going to have to put our bodies on the line and get arrested. It's the fight of our time, maybe the fight of all time. And we should all be honored to be a small part of it. Help ensure that our planet is protected for all future generations. Go to 350.org and join the fight today.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and we will cry, we will laugh and we will dance as they shout their marching orders beneath the helicopter blades. We shall seize the moment for a kiss behind the barricades. They will try to break our spirit, and at times they may succeed, but our love for the world is stronger than their greed. When the building is surrounded and hope begins to fade, in my final hour, a kiss behind the barricades. As the movement grows, there will be hills and bends, but at the center of the struggle are your lovers and your friends. And the more we hold each other up, the less we can be swayed. Here's to love and solidarity, and a kiss behind the barricades.